The golden hues of the setting sun stretched long shadows over the bustling city streets. Amidst the hurried crowd, 12-year-old Calvin Reed, a scrappy, thin boy with unruly brown hair and tattered clothes, moved with practiced ease. But before we dive into the story, drop a comment below about where you're watching from. Enjoy the journey, everyone. His sharp blue eyes darted around, scanning every corner like a seasoned survivor. Hunger gnawed at his insides, a feeling he had long since grown accustomed to. "Not another night on an empty stomach," Calvin muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Ducking between overflowing trash bins, he rifled through discarded scraps, his nimble fingers picking through with an expertise no child should ever have. The rancid smell made his stomach churn, but hunger was stronger than disgust. He found a stale piece of bread and quickly shoved it into his pocket. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Hey kid, get lost. I don't need filthy beggars scaring off customers," an irritated shopkeeper barked, waving a broom. Calvin flinched, instinctively shrinking back. Years on the streets had taught him to avoid angry adults. "Sorry, sir. I'm leaving." He hurried away, his heart racing. His stomach still ached, but the fear of a beating outweighed his hunger for now. As he walked, his sharp eyes caught sight of a man, polished, powerful, important. Gerald Hayes. His pristine suit and polished shoes screamed wealth, a stark contrast to Calvin's ragged appearance. He walked briskly, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. "I don't care what the numbers say. Sell now. We can't afford to lose more." Gerald snapped, frustration etched into his furrowed brow. Calvin watched with both admiration and longing. What would it be like to have a life like that? To wear clean clothes, to have a home, a full stomach? He was lost in thought when he saw it, the danger approaching in the form of a speeding car. Gerald, too distracted by his conversation, stepped off the curb, oblivious to the vehicle bearing down on him. A deafening honk, screeching tires, a moment of pure instinct. Calvin's body moved before his mind could catch up. He lunged forward, shoving Gerald with all his strength. The impact was brutal. The world spun. Gerald hit the pavement hard, the car swerving wildly before coming to a screeching halt just inches from Calvin. Gasps erupted from onlookers. Pain laced through Calvin's arm, but he ignored it. He crawled toward Gerald, his small hands shaking as he gently touched the man's face. "Sir, can you hear me? Stay awake. Please. Help is coming." Gerald groaned, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His eyes, dazed with pain, locked onto Calvin's. "You saved me. Don't talk like that. You're going to be okay. Just hold on," Calvin urged, panic creeping into his voice. Sirens wailed in the distance, but Gerald's grip on reality wavered. His eyelids fluttered, his body growing limp. Calvin's heart pounded. "Please, don't give up. You're not alone." With a Herculean effort, Gerald squeezed the boy's hand, his voice weak but resolute. "Calvin, you gave me a second chance. I won't waste it." As paramedics swarmed in, Calvin stepped back, his own wounds forgotten in the wake of something bigger. A moment had changed everything. He had saved a man's life. But what Calvin didn't expect was that this man would change his own life in return. The night was cold, the streets nearly deserted, save for the occasional flicker of headlights slicing through the darkness. Calvin's breath was heavy as he crouched beside the unconscious man, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. A concerned voice cut through the silence. "What happened?" Calvin jerked his head up to see a middle-aged woman, her face lined with worry. "I tried to save him," Calvin stammered, his voice unsteady. "He was about to be hit by a car, but I wasn't fast enough." The woman's eyes widened in shock as she took a closer look at the injured man. "Wait, I know this man. That's Gerald Hawkins, the millionaire." Calvin's breath hitched. A millionaire? The thought of a reward momentarily flashed in his mind, but he pushed it away, ashamed. None of that mattered now. A man's life was at stake. Before he could process anything further, the sharp wail of sirens filled the air. The ambulance screeched to a halt, its red and blue lights painting the street in an urgent glow. Paramedics rushed out, assessing Gerald's condition with swift precision. "What happened here? One of them asked, already checking for a pulse. Calvin swallowed hard, his throat dry. He was about to be hit. I tried to push him out of the way, but the car still hit him. The paramedics exchanged quick glances before lifting Gerald onto the stretcher. One of them turned to Calvin. "You should get checked out too. You're hurt." Calvin barely noticed the bruises on his arms, the scrape on his cheek. His only concern was Gerald. "I'm coming with you," he declared, his voice leaving no room for argument. The paramedic hesitated before nodding. "Fine, but don't get in the way." Calvin climbed into the ambulance, his gaze fixed on Gerald's pale, unmoving form. Without thinking, he reached out and grasped the man's cold hand. "You're going to be okay, Mr. Hawkins. You have to be." As the ambulance sped through the city streets, Calvin stared at the man he had saved. At that moment, he made a silent promise. No matter what happened, he wouldn't abandon him. At the hospital the moment they arrived, doctors and nurses swarmed around Gerald, their movements precise and urgent. Calvin tried to follow, but a paramedic gently held him back. "Easy, kid. Let the doctors do their job." Calvin hesitated, his eyes locked on the emergency room doors. But what if he wakes up and doesn't know where he is? A nurse with kind eyes stepped forward. "He's in good hands. Now, let's take care of you." Calvin relented, finally acknowledging the dull ache in his arm. The nurse led him to a small room and began cleaning his wounds. "You're quite the hero," she said, smiling. "Not many people would have done what you did." I did what I had to," Calvin muttered, looking away. The nurse finished bandaging his arm. "Now how about some food? You must be starving." As if on cue, his stomach growled. The nurse chuckled and handed him a sandwich. Calvin ate quickly, but his thoughts never strayed far from Gerald. Hours ticked by in the waiting room. The clock's steady ticking felt like a countdown, each second stretching into eternity. Every time a doctor walked past, Calvin's heart leapt in anticipation. Finally, the doors to the intensive care unit swung open. A doctor stepped out, his expression unreadable. "Family of Gerald Hawkins," he called. Calvin jumped to his feet. "I am with him." The doctor studied him before nodding. "Mr. Hawkins is stable. He sustained severe injuries, but he's out of immediate danger. He will need time to recover." Calvin exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging in relief. "Can I see him?" The doctor hesitated. "He's resting. It's best to wait until tomorrow." Before Calvin could respond, a sharp voice cut in. "What's going on here?" Calvin turned to see a woman in a crisp suit, a briefcase in hand. Her piercing eyes assessed him with suspicion. "I'm Diane Foster, a social worker," she announced. "I was informed about an unaccompanied minor involved in an accident." Calvin's stomach clenched. He knew what that meant. Foster homes, orphanages, a cycle he had spent years trying to escape. "I'm not unaccompanied," he protested. "I'm with Mr. Hawkins." Diane arched an eyebrow. "And what exactly is your relationship with him?" Calvin swallowed hard, his mind racing. How could he explain it? Before he could speak, the doctor interjected. "This boy saved Mr. Hawkins' life. If not for him, he wouldn't be here." Diane's gaze softened slightly. "Is that true?" Calvin nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, ma'am. I pushed him out of the way. I tried, but I wasn't fast enough." Diane studied him for a long moment before sighing. "Well, Calvin, it seems fate has tied you to Mr. Hawkins, but that still doesn't explain where you'll stay tonight." Calvin glanced toward the emergency room doors, determination settling in his chest. "I'm not going anywhere. I'll wait right here for him." Diane folded her arms. "We'll see about that." Calvin didn't care what she said. He had made a promise, to Gerald and to himself. And no matter what, he wasn't going to break it. As the hospital bustled around him, Calvin settled into a chair, ready to face whatever came next. Fate had brought them together. Now, it was up to him to see it through. Diane studied Calvin for a moment, then sighed, rubbing her temples. "Well, this complicates matters. Normally, I'd have to take you to a temporary shelter, but given the circumstances—" Her voice trailed off as she weighed her options. Just then, A nurse burst out of the ICU breathless. "Doctor, Mr. Hawkins is awake. He's asking for the boy." The doctor and Diane exchanged surprised glances before turning to Calvin. "Well," the doctor said, motioning toward the door, "it seems you have a visit to make." Calvin hesitated. His stomach churned with nerves. He looked at Diane, who gave him a small nod. "Go ahead. We need to speak with Mr. Hawkins anyway." Heart pounding, Calvin followed the doctor through the sterile white halls. The scent of antiseptic burned his nose, and the beeping monitors made him anxious. But he was determined. He had to see Gerald. The doctor gently pulled back the curtain around the hospital bed. Calvin gasped. Gerald lay there, hooked up to various machines, his face pale, but his eyes sharp. When he saw Calvin, a faint, tired smile curved his lips. "Calvin," Gerald rasped, his voice weak but warm. "You're all right. Thank God. I was worried." Tears welled in Calvin's eyes as he stepped closer. "Mr. Gerald, you're alive. I was so scared." His voice cracked, and he struggled to keep his emotions in check. Gerald reached out a trembling hand. Calvin instinctively grasped it, his small fingers dwarfed by the man's. "Thanks to you, my boy," Gerald whispered, squeezing his hand. "You saved my life." Calvin bowed his head, ashamed. "But you still got hurt. I wasn't fast enough." Gerald shook his head firmly. "Don't say that. Without you, I wouldn't be here. You're a hero, Calvin." Calvin's breath hitched. A hero. No one had ever called him that before. At that moment, Diane entered the room with the doctor. "Mr. Hawkins, I'm Diane Foster, a social worker. We need to discuss Calvin's situation." Gerald's gaze flicked between Diane and the boy. "Situation? Calvin is with me." There was a protective edge to his voice that surprised even Calvin. Diane cleared her throat. "Mr. Hawkins, I understand you're grateful, but Calvin is an unaccompanied minor. We have procedures." Gerald struggled to sit up, ignoring the doctor's protests. "Listen, Miss Foster, this boy saved my life. He's not going anywhere." Diane looked ready to argue, but Gerald cut her off. He turned to Calvin, his expression thoughtful. "There's something I'd like to do for you. Something to show my gratitude." Calvin's heart pounded. Was Gerald going to offer him money? A home? He didn't want to seem greedy, but the thought of not returning to the streets was almost too good to be true. Gerald continued, "I'd like to give you a reward. Anything you want. Money, a house. Name it." Calvin's throat tightened. His mind swirled with possibilities. But deep down, he knew what he truly wanted. Taking a deep breath, he spoke, his voice trembling. "I don't want your money, sir. I just want to know what it feels like to have a father, even if it's just for one day. Could you pretend to be my dad?" Silence fell over the room. Calvin clenched his fists, afraid he'd asked for too much. He dared not look at Gerald's face. Then, Gerald let out shaky breath. A tear slipped down his cheek. "Calvin," he whispered, "it would be an honor." Calvin's eyes widened in disbelief. "Really? You'd do that for me?" Gerald nodded, arms outstretched. Without hesitation, Calvin threw himself into the embrace, sobbing against the man's chest. "Thank you, thank you." Diane wiped at her eyes discreetly. Clearing her throat, she composed herself. "Mr. Hawkins, I understand you want to help. Legally, this can't be permanent. But, given the circumstances, I think we can arrange something temporary." Calvin could hardly believe his ears. In a matter of hours, his life had transformed from loneliness to warmth. Even if it was only for a day, he finally had someone who cared. The sun bathed the amusement park in golden light. The scent of cotton candy and popcorn filled the air. Laughter and cheerful music surrounded them. Calvin gripped Gerald's hand, his excitement barely contained. "Mr. Hawkins, look at all the rides. Can we go on every single one?" Gerald chuckled, a warmth blooming in his chest. "Of course we can. This is your day, Calvin. Let's make every second count." Calvin's face lit up with pure joy. He pointed to the tallest roller coaster, its track twisting toward the sky. "That one. I want to go on that one first." Gerald hesitated. "You sure? It's a pretty intense ride." Calvin nodded vigorously, I'm brave. I can handle it. Unable to resist his enthusiasm, Gerald agreed. As they climbed into the cart, Calvin clutched his arm. What if I fall out? Gerald squeezed his hand. You won't. I promise. I'm right here. As the ride climbed higher and higher, Calvin held his breath. The world stretched out beneath them. Then whoosh! They plunged. Calvin screamed, but soon, his terror turned into laughter. Gerald, who had started the ride tense with worry, found himself laughing too. When the ride ended, Calvin's face was glowing. That was amazing. Can we go again? Gerald laughed, ruffling the boy's hair. How about something different first? We have the whole day ahead of us. As the day wore on, they rode the Ferris wheel, played carnival games, and ate ice cream until their stomachs hurt. To anyone watching, they looked like any father and son. But they weren't. Calvin was a boy who had spent his life surviving on the streets. Gerald was a man who, until yesterday, had no idea this child existed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Calvin looked up at Gerald with shining eyes. This was the best day of my life. Gerald felt something deep in his chest, a feeling he hadn't known he was missing. Mine too, kid. Mine too. And for that one day, they were exactly what they both needed, family. The city lights blurred as the carousel spun, laughter echoing in the crisp evening air. For the first time in his life, Calvin felt weightless, free. I'm flying, Mr. Hawkins. I'm flying. Calvin shouted, stretching his arms wide like wings. Gerald Hawkins, a man used to boardrooms and billion-dollar deals, chuckled, waving back at the boy. Something inside him shifted. Profits, power, prestige, all seemed insignificant compared to this single moment of pure joy. Then, in an instant, the magic shattered. Calvin, in his excitement, leaped off the carousel before it stopped. His foot slipped. A cry of pain pierced the air. Calvin! Gerald's heart clenched as he sprinted to the boy. Calvin sat on the cold pavement, clutching his ankle, tears streaking his dirt-covered face. The contrast was gut-wrenching. A moment ago, he was carefree. Now he was just a scared, injured child. Gerald knelt beside him, voice urgent yet gentle. Let me see, kiddo. Calvin hesitated before letting Gerald examine his ankle. It was swelling fast, a deep scrape darkening the skin. The boy sobbed, his voice small, fragile. It hurts, Mr. Hawkins. It hurts so much. Gerald swallowed hard. He wasn't just looking at an injured child. He was looking at a boy who had learned that pain wasn't just physical. Pain meant survival. Pain meant running slower. Pain meant vulnerability on the streets. I got you, Gerald whispered, scooping him up. We need to get you to a doctor. Calvin trembled in his arms, pressing his face against Gerald's chest. I'm sorry. I ruined our day. Gerald tightened his grip. You didn't ruin anything, Calvin. And I'm not leaving you, understand? But deep inside, he knew things weren't that simple. The antiseptic scent of the hospital hit them as Gerald carried Calvin inside. The boy whimpered in pain, his tiny hands clutching Gerald's coat. A nurse rushed him into an exam room, her eyes flicking between the billionaire in an Armani suit and the scrawny street kid in torn clothes. A young doctor entered, adjusting his glasses. Let's take a look. His hands were careful but firm as he examined Calvin's ankle. Looks like a fracture. We'll need an X-ray to confirm. Then, a cold voice cut through the moment. Mr. Hawkins is not this child's guardian. Gerald turned. A woman in a stiff suit stood in the doorway. Ms. Reynolds, the same social worker he'd encountered before. Her eyes were sharp, calculating. Calvin's grip on Gerald's sleeve tightened. Please, don't let them take me. His voice was barely a whisper, thick with fear. Ms. Reynolds, Gerald said, controlling his anger. The kid needs treatment. Can we deal with red tape later? The doctor, sensing the tension, cleared his throat. Let's do the X-ray first. Follow me. Gerald carried Calvin down the hallway, but he could feel Ms. Reynolds' gaze burning into his back. You promised, Calvin murmured against his chest. Promise again. Gerald's jaw clenched. I'm here, kid. I'm not leaving you. Outside the X-ray room, Ms. Reynolds confronted him. Mr. Hawkins, I understand your intentions, But this isn't how things work. You can't just take a child off the streets. Gerald's patience snapped. So what? You put him back in the system? Send him to another foster home where he gets ignored, or worse. Ms. Reynolds hesitated. There are procedures. To hell with procedures. Gerald hissed, lowering his voice when he noticed Calvin's frightened eyes peeking from the x-ray room. I'm not some reckless millionaire throwing money around. I care about this boy. The doctor returned, holding up the x-ray. It's a clean break. He'll need a cast, but he'll heal fine. Gerald exhaled in relief. But then, the doctor hesitated. I need legal authorization to proceed with treatment. Ms. Reynolds straightened. That authorization is not his to give. Panic surged in Calvin's eyes. No, please. I don't want to go with her. He clung to Gerald, his frail fingers digging into his coat. I trust you, Mr. Hawkins. You're the only one I trust. Gerald turned to the social worker, his voice low, steely. Tell me something, Ms. Reynolds. Right now, at this moment, what's more important? Your paperwork, or this boy? She stared at Calvin, at the sheer desperation in his eyes. For the first time, her rigid posture softened. Finally, she sighed. Fine, we authorize treatment. But Mr. Hawkins, this conversation isn't over. Gerald didn't care. All that mattered was Calvin. As the nurses wheeled Calvin away to set his cast, the boy looked up at Gerald, eyes still shimmering with tears. Will you still be here when I wake up? Gerald bent down, brushing Calvin's unruly hair from his forehead. I told you, kid. I'm not going anywhere. Calvin nodded, gripping Gerald's hand until his eyelids grew heavy. As he drifted into sleep, Gerald sat back, exhaling deeply. A billionaire who once measured life in profits now sat in a hospital room, his heart wholly invested in a boy who had nothing. And for the first time in years, Gerald Hawkins felt like a man who had everything. The social worker's voice broke the silence. Mr. Hawkins, we need to talk about what happens next. Gerald turned to face her, his mind already made up. He wasn't letting Calvin go. Not now. Not ever. A dim hospital light flickers as the quiet hum of machines fills the air. Gerald sits beside Calvin's bed, holding his hand firmly. The boy's face is pale, exhaustion weighing down his small frame, but his grip is tight, as if letting go would mean losing everything. Calvin said, Mr. Hawkins, you came back. I thought you left. Gerald's soft smile, voice steady. I promised I wouldn't, didn't I? And I always keep my promises. Calvin's eyes glisten with unshed tears, but the flicker of hope in them is undeniable. Just then, the door creaks open. Gerald looks up, his expression shifting as the social worker steps inside, her presence like a cold gust of wind in an already fragile space. Social worker said, Mr. Hawkins, we need to talk about Calvin's future. Calvin stiffens, gripping Gerald's hand tighter. The fear returns. The fear of the unknown, of being taken away. Calvin barely said, she's here to take me, isn't she? Gerald said, no one's taking you anywhere, Calvin. Not without a fight. Gerald steps out into the hallway with the social worker, his jaw tight, hands clenched. The overhead fluorescent lights cast long shadows, making the corridor feel colder than it already is. Social worker, calm but authoritative. I know you care about him, Mr. Hawkins, but the system has protocols. Calvin is an unaccompanied minor. He has to be placed in state custody. Gerald, angered, frustrated. A system that already failed him? Foster homes? Temporary shelters? He deserves more than that. Social worker, soft sigh, measured tone. I won't lie to you. It's not perfect, but we have to follow the law. Gerald runs a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. His mind races. Then, determination hardens his features. Gerald, serious, unwavering. What if I foster him? Is there a process for that? A flicker of surprise crosses the social worker's face. She studies him as if trying to gauge his sincerity. Social worker, cautious but intrigued. It's a long, complicated process. Background checks, home evaluations, training. Gerald, interrupting, voice firm. I don't care how long it takes. I'll do it. The doctor steps out of Calvin's room, looking exhausted but satisfied. Doctor, nodding reassuringly. The fracture's been realigned. He's stable, but he's asking for you, Mr. Hawkins. Gerald barely acknowledges the doctor before pushing open the door. Calvin looks up immediately, his face filled with silent questions. Calvin's small voice, hesitant. Am I going back to the streets? Gerald, kneeling beside the bed, gripping Calvin's hand. No. You're not alone anymore, Calvin. I'll fight for you. Calvin's lips quiver as he fights back tears. But for the first time in a long time, he believes it. A pale morning light filters through the blinds. Gerald, still in the same chair, stirs awake as the distant sound of footsteps approaches. He blinks, instinctively reaching for Calvin's hand, only to hear the door swing open abruptly. The social worker stands in the doorway, flanked by 2 hospital security guards. Social worker, firm, professional. Mr. Hawkins, we've allowed this long enough. It's time for Calvin to come with us. Gerald stands instantly, blocking their path. His heart pounds. Calvin stirs in bed, his eyes fluttering open, and panic grips his features. Calvin panicked, gripping Gerald's sleeve. Mr. Hawkins, please, don't let them take me. Gerald, voice steel-hard, shielding the boy. You can't just take him like he's some case file. He's a child. A scared, hurt child. Social worker, soft sigh, reluctant understanding in her eyes. Mr. Hawkins, I know this is difficult, but you have no legal authority. We have to follow procedures. One of the guards steps forward, hesitant but firm. Calvin lets out a choked sob and tries to scramble away, but his injured leg stops him. Calvin desperate, sobbing. No, I want to stay with him. He's the only one who cares about me. Gerald clenches his jaw, fury boiling inside him. He looks at the guards, then at the social worker. Gerald, low voice, warning tone. Then change the rules, because I won't let you take him. The room is heavy with tension, the air thick with unspoken conflict. Calvin grips Gerald's hand tighter, and in that moment, it's clear, Gerald will not give up. Not now. Not ever. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the hospital room as Calvin stirred restlessly against the crisp sheets. A soft clatter echoed through the room, a small object slipping from beneath his oversized hospital gown, hitting the cold, tiled floor. No, my necklace. Calvin gasped, his voice cracking with fear and desperation. He lunged forward, but his cast leg restrained him, halting his frantic attempt to retrieve it. Gerald, acting on instinct, crouched down and grasped the fallen object. As his fingers closed around the cool silver metal, an unexplainable shiver ran down his spine. When he stood and opened his palm, time seemed to stop. It was a locket. With trembling hands, he flipped it open. His breath hitched, and his heart slammed against his ribs as he stared at the delicate photograph inside. The smiling face looking back at him was one he thought he'd never see again. Evelyn, his missing wife. His voice came out in a breathless whisper. Evelyn. The room plunged into stunned silence. The social worker, who had been standing at the foot of the bed, stiffened. Her sharp gaze flickered between Gerald and the locket. Sensing the gravity of the moment, she subtly motioned for the security guards to step back. Clearing her throat, she took a cautious step forward. Mr. Hawkins, do you know the woman in the photo? Gerald's throat was dry. He could barely form the words. It's my wife. She disappeared years ago. I thought she was dead. A heavy pause followed. Calvin, still gripping the hospital sheets, darted his wife, anxious eyes between Gerald and the locket. The pretty lady, he murmured hesitantly. She gave me the necklace. Said it was to protect me. Gerald's head snapped toward Calvin, his gaze burning with intensity. You saw this woman? When? Where? His voice carried a desperate urgency. Calvin flinched at the intensity, but nodded quickly. It was a few months ago. She was on the street where I used to sleep. She looked scared, but she was really kind. She gave me food and let me sleep in an old abandoned building. She told me she was trying to start over. Said she had an important secret. Gerald felt his pulse skyrocket. Every word Calvin spoke felt like a puzzle piece snapping into place. What kind of secret? His voice was barely a whisper. Calvin scrunched his brows, struggling to recall. Then suddenly, his eyes widened. She said she was going to have a baby. Gerald stumbled back, gripping the hospital bed for support. The room spun. His breath caught in his throat. She was pregnant? He murmured, the realization striking him like a physical blow. The social worker's posture tensed. Mr. Hawkins, I understand this is a lot to process, but Calvin still needs to come with us. Gerald's head snapped up, determination igniting in his gaze. You can't take him now. Don't you see? He's the only lead I have to find Evelyn. This isn't negotiable, Mr. Hawkins, the social worker responded, her voice hardening as she motioned to the guards. Take the boy. The guards stepped forward, but Gerald moved faster, planting himself firmly in their path. He spread his arms wide, forming a barrier between Calvin and the advancing men. You're not taking him anywhere. Not without a court order. Calvin clung to Gerald's sleeve, his small fingers trembling. Please don't let them take me. I want to help find the pretty lady. The social worker let out an exasperated sigh, rubbing her temples. Mr. Hawkins, please don't force me to call the police. You're interfering with an official process. Then call them. Gerald shot back, his voice raw with emotion. But I'm not letting you take Calvin. He's the only chance I have of finding my wife. The room tensed, thick with charged energy. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sounds were Calvin's ragged breathing and the rhythmic beep of the hospital machines. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the social worker let out a long, measured sigh. She looked at Calvin, then back at Gerald. Fine, she said at last, her voice weary but resigned. You have 24 hours, Mr. Hawkins. Get a lawyer and obtain a temporary court order. If you don't, we'll be back. With the police. Relief crashed over Gerald, but he knew the battle had just begun. As the social worker and guards exited, Calvin still clung to Gerald's side. He brushed a hand over the boy's hair, offering a small, reassuring smile. It's going to be okay, Calvin. We'll find her together. Calvin peered up at him, his eyes filled with uncertainty and hope. Promise you won't let me go. Gerald swallowed the lump in his throat. He couldn't make promises he wasn't sure he could keep, but looking into the boy's trusting eyes, he found himself nodding. I promise. We're in this together. As Calvin finally relaxed against the pillows, Gerald glanced down at the locket, Evelyn's face smiling up at him. His chest tightened. The next 24 hours would be critical. He had a fight ahead of him, and he wouldn't stop until he had answers, until he had her back. Fade in it. Gerald Hawkins' study, night a grand, dimly lit study. The fireplace flickers, casting restless shadows across the towering bookshelves. Gerald Hawkins, a man burdened by grief, sits in an armchair, his fingers gripping the armrests as he leans forward, eyes locked onto the trembling boy before him, Calvin. Calvin, nervously, biting his lip. It's a lot to process. I can tell you more about Mistress Evelyn, if you want. Gerald straightens, his intense gaze pinning Calvin in place. His heart pounds. Evelyn, the name alone tightens his chest. He motions for the boy to continue, afraid that speaking might shatter the fragile moment. Calvin swallows, as if gathering courage. Calvin, softly. She was like an angel, Mr. Hawkins. She found me one night. I hadn't eaten for days. Her eyes were kind, but she looked exhausted, hungry, and sad. A lump forms in Gerald's throat. He grips the arms of his chair. Gerald, hoarse. How did she look, Calvin? Was she okay? Calvin's brow furrows as he struggles to recall every detail. Calvin, she was thin, too thin, and she coughed a lot, but she still smiled at me. She took me to this abandoned house where she was staying. Gerald leans in, absorbing every word. His mind spins. Why was Evelyn living like this? Calvin hesitates, then continues. She gave me food, the last piece of bread she had. She told me it was important that I eat. But then she started crying. I didn't know why, but she looked so heartbroken. She kept saying she was sorry, that one day things would be okay. Gerald stiffens. The image of Evelyn, sick, starving, yet still helping a street child, hits him like a dagger to the heart. He suddenly rises, pacing the room in agitation. Gerald, muttering to himself, "Why, Evelyn? What happened to you? Why are you suffering like this?" Calvin watches, shifting uneasily. Calvin, Mr. Hawkins. She carried a great weight. Something haunted her. She was always looking over her shoulder, like she was afraid. Gerald halts. A shiver runs down his spine. Afraid? Of what? Of whom? Gerald, urgent. Did she ever say why? Anything about what she was running from? Calvin hesitates, then shakes his head. Calvin, no. She never talked about herself. Just cried sometimes when she thought I wasn't looking. Gerald clenches his fists, his mind racing with dark possibilities. He feels the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. The sudden doorbell pierces the silence. Gerald and Calvin both flinch. Gerald checks the clock. 24 hours are up. A cold dread settles in his stomach. He already knows who's at the door. Gerald, low voice, Calvin. Listen to me. Stay here. No matter what you hear, do not move. Understood? Calvin nods, fear widening his eyes. Calvin, Mr. Hawkins, it's her, isn't it? The social worker? Gerald doesn't answer. His silence is enough. Int. Hawkins Mansion, entrance hall, night. Gerald steels himself before opening the door. The social worker, a stern woman with sharp eyes and an air of finality, stands there. Social worker Mr. Hawkins, time's up. I've come to collect Calvin. Gerald blocks the doorway. Gerald, pleading, please. I just need more time. You don't understand, social worker firm. I understand more than you think. But rules exist for a reason. Calvin must come with me. Gerald hesitates, torn between rage and helplessness. But resistance will only make things worse. Gritting his teeth, he steps aside, allowing her entry. Int. Living room, night. Calvin shrinks into the couch as the social worker approaches. Social worker, soft but firm. It's time, Calvin. We found a safe place for you. Calvin shakes his head violently. Calvin, no. I don't want to go. I want to stay with Mr. Hawkins. The social worker sighs, expecting resistance. Social worker, Calvin. Mr. Hawkins isn't a legal guardian. We have to follow protocol. Gerald sees the terror in Calvin's eyes. He steps between them. Gerald, please. You don't understand. Calvin is my only connection to my missing wife. The social worker hesitates, caught off guard. Social worker, gentler. Mr. Hawkins, I get it. But Calvin's safety comes first. Then, in a desperate move, Calvin limps forward and throws himself into Gerald's arms. Calvin, crying, "Don't let them take me, Mr. Hawkins. Please. You need me. I can help find Mistress Evelyn." Gerald holds the boy tight, his own emotions threatening to break through. The social worker watches with a mix of compassion and duty. Social worker, Mr. Hawkins. Calvin must come with me. Now. Gerald clenches his jaw. He knows she won't back down. His mind screams at him to fight, but legally, he's powerless. Finally, he pulls back and looks into Calvin's tear-filled eyes. Gerald, softly, I will find you, Calvin. And together, we will find Evelyn. I promise. Calvin grips his coat desperately. Calvin, you promise you won't give up? Gerald, never. After a long, painful moment, Calvin releases his grip. He limps toward the social worker, glancing back with every step. When he reaches the door, he turns one last time. Calvin, she always said one day, things would be okay, that she'd find her way back. Gerald nods, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He watches, helpless, as the door closes. Int. Hawkins Mansion, living room, night silence. Gerald collapses to his knees, Evelyn's locket clenched in his fist. His world has just fallen apart. Gerald, whispering, I will find you. Both of you. No matter what it takes. Fade to black. Calvin sat on his bed, the dim glow of the shelter's overhead light casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. He had spent years on the streets, learning to read people, and something about this couple set every nerve in his body on high alert. The shelter's door creaked open, and a social worker stepped inside, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Calvin, this is Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood. They're interested in meeting you. By her side stood a couple he had never seen before. Mr. Blackwood was tall and thin, his smile cold and calculated. Mrs. Blackwood was short and stout, her gaze sweeping over Calvin as though she were appraising a piece of livestock. "Hello," Calvin said hesitantly, not moving from the bed. His fingers dug into the thin blanket, a nervous habit he had developed over the years. Mr. Blackwood took a step forward, his smile widening into something that made Calvin's stomach twist. "So, this is the famous Calvin. We've heard so much about you." His voice was velvety smooth, but there was something unsettling about it. Calvin frowned. "Heard from who?" he asked, his distrust evident in his voice. Mrs. Blackwood let out a laugh, sharp and unpleasant. "Oh, word travels fast in the adoption world, dear. Especially about special boys like you." Calvin felt his pulse quicken. Special? What did that mean? The social worker beamed, completely oblivious to his discomfort. "The Blackwoods have a wonderful home out of town. They'd love to take you in." Out of town. The words hit Calvin like a punch to the gut. That meant leaving the city, leaving Gerald, losing any chance of finding Evelyn. "I don't want to go," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I want to stay here." A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, passed between the Blackwoods before Mr. Blackwood's smile returned. This time, it looked more like a grimace. Now, Calvin," he said, his tone low and deliberate. "Don't be ungrateful. We're offering you a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." Mrs. Blackwood's voice turned honeyed. "Think of all the experiences you'll have with us." The way she said experiences sent a cold shiver down Calvin's spine. The social worker, satisfied with how the conversation was going, stepped toward the door. "I'll leave you to talk a bit. Calvin, behave, okay? This could be your only chance at a family." As soon as she left, the air in the room seemed to thicken. The Blackwoods moved closer, their smiles no longer reassuring but predatory. Mr. Blackwood sat on the edge of the bed, his gaze unwavering. "Tell us about your time with Mr. Hawkins. It must have been interesting living with such a rich and powerful man." Calvin stiffened. "It wasn't anything special. He was just helping me." Mrs. Blackwood let out another unsettling laugh. "Oh, I'm sure he was, dear. Men like him are always helping boys like you." A wave of nausea rolled through Calvin as he caught the insinuation in her words. He wanted to scream, to defend Gerald, to tell them they had it all wrong, but a deep-rooted survival instinct told him to stay silent. Mr. Blackwood stood abruptly. "No matter. Tomorrow, you'll be with us, and we can leave all that unpleasantness behind." Calvin's heart pounded. "Tomorrow." Mrs. Blackwood smiled, her eyes glinting with something unreadable. "Oh yes, dear. It's all arranged. Tomorrow morning, we'll be on the plane." With that, they left, shutting the door behind them. Calvin sat frozen, his thoughts racing. In less than 24 hours, he would be taken away. Away from Gerald, away from the only hope he had left. "No, I can't let this happen." That night, while the other boys slept, Calvin remained awake, his mind working furiously. He needed a plan. He needed to escape. He slid out of bed, his bare feet silent against the cold floor. He knew the night staff's routines, their shifts, their blind spots. He had watched. He had learned. Slowly, he made his way to the door, pressing his ear against the wood. Voices drifted in from the hallway. "Poor Calvin," one voice murmured, "being taken so far away after everything he's been through." "I know," another replied. "And once he's out of the country, that millionaire Hawkins will never be able to find him again." Calvin's breath caught in his throat. His suspicions were confirmed. This wasn't an adoption. This was something else. Something worse. "I have to escape. Tonight." With practiced precision, he picked a lock using a paperclip he had hidden earlier. A soft click. The door creaked open. He peeked out, empty hallway. He took a step forward, then another. Every shadow felt alive. Every creak of the wooden floor felt like a gunshot. His heart pounded as he reached the staircase leading to the front door. Then, "What do you think you're doing?" A deep voice sliced through the silence. Calvin whirled around. A night guard stood there, arms crossed, eyes sharp with suspicion. I was just," Calvin stammered, his mind scrambling for an excuse. The guard's expression darkened. "Go back to your room. Now." Defeat crashed over Calvin like a tidal wave. His escape had failed. Back in his room, he curled up on his bed, watching as another staff member took a seat near the door. He was under constant watch now. Any hope of escape had vanished. "Sorry, Mr. Hawkins," he thought, silent tears streaking his face. "I tried. I really tried." The next morning came too soon. With a heavy heart, Calvin climbed into the Blackwood's sleek black car. The door shut with a dull thud, sealing his fate. He stared out the window, his chest tight with dread. Mr. Blackwood started the engine, the growl of the car echoing his own despair. Calvin's eyes burned as the shelter grew smaller in the rearview mirror. Then, the distant roar of an engine, tires screeching against asphalt. A silver sports car rounded the corner at breakneck speed, skidding to a halt in front of the shelter. Calvin's heart stopped. "Gerald." The Blackwood stiffened. Mr. Blackwood's fingers tightened around the wheel. Mrs. Blackwood's face twisted in anger. The driver's door of the sports car flew open, and out stepped Gerald Hawkins. His eyes, dark and furious, locked onto the Blackwoods. Calvin barely had time to breathe before Gerald took a step forward, his voice thunderous and undeniable. The screeching of brakes shattered the silence, sending startled birds into the sky. Calvin's heart slammed against his ribs as he saw the man stepping out of the sleek black car. "Mr. Hawkins," he cried, his voice muffled inside the car. He pressed his palms against the window, so hard they turned white. "I'm here." The car door slammed shut, and Gerald Hawkins emerged. His usual sharp suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, as though he had spent the night running his hands through it. But his eyes burned with desperation and resolve. "Stop!" Gerald's voice thundered as he sprinted towards the Blackwood's car. "Nobody is going anywhere." The street fell into stunned silence. Mr. Blackwood stiffened in the driver's seat, his grip tightening on the wheel until his knuckles turned white. Mrs. Blackwood clutched her purse like a lifeline. The social worker hesitated, confusion flickering across her face. Her high heels clicked against the pavement as she took a cautious step forward. "Mr. Hawkins, what are you doing here?" she asked, adjusting her glasses. "We've already explained. You have no legal rights over Calvin." Gerald, panting but unwavering, lifted a crumpled envelope. His fingers trembled, but his grip remained firm. "That's where you're wrong," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I have an official document. Calvin is my son." The social worker took the envelope, her hands shaking as she unfolded the paper. The tension in the air was suffocating. The sound of rustling paper felt deafening. Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood exchanged panicked glances. Inside the car, Calvin's breath came in shallow gasps. He wiped the fogged window with a sleeve, his wide eyes locked onto Gerald. He hardly dared to hope. After a moment that felt like eternity, the social worker's eyes widened. This seems legitimate, but how?" Gerald stepped forward, his voice raw and unyielding. "Let me tell you how. Let me tell you why I'm here, why I fought tooth and nail for this moment." A hush fell over the street as Gerald spoke, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had lost everything and found something worth fighting for. "Calvin isn't just some boy I met. He's the boy who saved me, not just physically, but in every way that matters. When I lost my wife, I lost myself. I drowned in work, in money, in meaningless success. Then one day, this brave boy risked his own life to save a stranger. Me." Calvin's throat tightened. His fingers dug into the car seat. He didn't ask for anything in return. Just one day, a single day, to experience what it would be like to have a father. And that's when I realized the truth. I wasn't pretending anymore. This boy, this incredible, selfless boy, became my family. The social worker swallowed hard, her grip tightening on the document. Mrs. Blackwood's face was drained of color. Mr. Blackwood remained stone-faced, his jaw clenched. Gerald took another step forward. "When they took him from me, I swore I wouldn't stop until he was back where he belonged. Not because I feel I owe him, but because I love him. Because he taught me that family isn't just blood, it's a choice. It's love. And Calvin is my son, in every way that counts." A sharp breath escaped Calvin's lips. Tears welled in his eyes, but he didn't dare move, didn't dare blink. He was afraid that if he looked away, the moment would disappear. Gerald's voice dropped, rough with emotion. And there's one more thing. He looked around, his gaze locking onto every person in that circle. Calvin is the key to finding my missing wife, the mother of my other child. He gave me hope when I had none left. He connected us in ways I never thought possible. So I fought. I used every resource, every favor, every last ounce of strength to be here today. The social worker wiped a stray tear from her eye, her fingers trembling as she signed the document with a decisive stroke of her pen. "Mr. Hawkins," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "Calvin is officially your legal ward." A heavy silence followed. Then Mr. Blackwood exhaled sharply, switching off the engine. Mrs. Blackwood's lips parted as if to protest, but her husband's glance silenced her. Calvin, his body numb from shock, fumbled with his seatbelt. His hands shook as he struggled with the buckle. Then click. It was released. He shoved the door open, sending it slamming into the car beside him, but no one seemed to care. He ran. "Mr. Hawkins." His voice cracked as he threw himself into Gerald's arms. "You came. You really came." Gerald caught him, lifting him off the ground as he spun him in a tight embrace. "Of course I came, champ. I told you, I'll never give up on you." His voice broke. Hawkins always keeps his promise. The social worker smiled gently, her eyes still glistening. She placed a hand on Calvin's shoulder. "Are you ready to go home?" Calvin turned to Gerald, then back to the social worker. A radiant smile broke across his tear-streaked face. "Yes," he whispered. "I'm ready." Gerald placed a protective arm around the boy's shoulders and pulled him close. "Come on, son." And for the first time in his life, Calvin knew. He wasn't alone anymore. He was going home. The city was alive with flickering neon lights, the hum of distant traffic, and the occasional wail of a siren. But in the heart of its labyrinthine alleys, where the streetlights barely reached, another world existed, a world of forgotten souls and untold stories. Gerald Hawkins gripped the steering wheel of his sleek black car, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows beyond the windshield. Beside him, Calvin sat tense, his small hands clutching the seat. The weight of anticipation pressed down on them both. "It was around here, Mr. Hawkins. I saw her in this alley months ago." Calvin's voice trembled as he pointed towards the darkened path between two crumbling buildings. Gerald nodded, his jaw tightening. "All right, but we move carefully. She's been lost for a long time. She might not recognize us, and now with a baby." His voice trailed off as he killed the engine and stepped out. The air was thick with the scent of damp concrete, rotting garbage, and something more profound, despair. The alley stretched before them like the mouth of a beast, swallowing them as they moved forward. Footsteps echoed. The sound bounced off the walls, merging with the distant honk of a taxi, a drunken laugh from a nearby club, and the rustle of rodents scurrying away. Calvin shivered. Gerald instinctively placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "What if she's not here? What if we never find her?" Calvin's voice was barely a whisper, laced with fear. Gerald swallowed his own doubts. "We don't give up, champ. We keep searching, no matter how long it takes." They ventured deeper into the alley, Gerald's flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. Trash bins lined the walls, some overturned, their contents spilling onto the cracked pavement. A stray cat darted past them, its glowing eyes reflecting the beam. And then a movement. Quick, skittish. A figure stirred in the shadows. Gerald's breath hitched. He lifted the flashlight, the beam catching a slender, disheveled woman. Her long, matted hair framed a face once familiar, now gaunt and weary. In her arms, a bundle squirmed a baby. His heart stopped. "Evelyn." She flinched, her wide, haunted eyes locked onto his. Gerald took a careful step forward, his voice gentle. "Is that really you? And is that our son?" She shrank back against the wall, clutching the baby tighter. Fear flickered in her gaze, mingled with something else, something raw and fractured. I don't know you," she whispered hoarsely. "Please leave me alone. I need to protect him." Gerald's chest tightened. The woman standing before him was not the Evelyn he remembered, warm, vibrant, full of life. This Evelyn was broken, lost in the shadows of a past she couldn't recall. Evelyn, it's me, Gerald. Your husband. We've been looking for you for months. His voice cracked with emotion. She shook her head violently. No, I don't remember. I don't. Her breaths came in sharp, panicked gasps. Calvin, sensing her distress, acted on instinct. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the necklace, the one Evelyn had given him months ago. Carefully, he stepped forward, holding it out. Look, you gave this to me. You said it would protect me. Do you remember? Evelyn's gaze dropped to the pendant. Her breath hitched. A flicker, a hesitation, and then a distant shout. A sudden rush of footsteps. Gerald spun around just as three men emerged from the opposite end of the alley, their faces obscured by the dim light. She belongs to us. One of them growled. The baby whimpered in Evelyn's arms. Gerald's pulse skyrocketed. He instinctively moved in front of Calvin, shielding him. Not anymore, he said coldly. She's coming home. The men stepped forward. The night held its breath. The night air was thick with suspense, the dim glow of the streetlights casting eerie shadows on the pavement. Evelyn's breath hitched as she clutched the locket around her neck, her fingers trembling over the small photo inside. The man before her, Gerald, his eyes desperate, his voice pleading. This man here is your husband, Calvin said, his voice breaking slightly. He's been looking for you. He saw your photo in the locket you gave me. Evelyn's gaze snapped to the locket, her heart pounding. Slowly, she pried it open, her eyes locking onto the tiny image within. A sharp gasp escaped her lips as memories rushed through her like a tidal wave. A wedding, a seaside home, Gerald's smiling face. Fragments of a life she had lost pieced themselves together, but they were hazy, incomplete. I remember something, she whispered, her voice barely audible. A ring, vows, and this baby. She cradled the infant closer to her chest, her mind reeling. I was alone, scared, but it's all so distant. Gerald stepped forward, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Yes, Evelyn. We were happy. You were pregnant when you disappeared. I've been searching for you and our child for months. And now, I've finally found you. His words sent another wave of emotions crashing over her. Evelyn swayed slightly, overwhelmed. Gerald caught her by the arms, steadying her. It's okay, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. You're safe now. We'll take care of you. Evelyn searched his face, her own a mixture of confusion and longing. I don't remember everything, she admitted. But I feel like I can trust you. It's like a part of me knew, even after all this time. Calvin, standing nearby, clutched his hands together, his heart hammering. He had waited for this moment, prayed for it. Mistress Evelyn, he said softly, stepping closer. When we met, you told me that one day, everything would be okay, that you'd find your way home. I think that day has come. Evelyn turned to the boy, her lips parting in a faint, uncertain smile. I said that, didn't I? She murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Her fingers tightened around the baby's blanket. I've been lost for so long, not just in the streets, but in my own mind. Gerald gently took her hand, his thumb caressing the back of it in a familiar gesture. Home is with us, Evelyn. It always has been, and it always will be. She looked down at their joined hands, then at Calvin, then at the baby. Confusion still clouded her eyes, but beneath it, there was something else, a flicker of hope. Hesitantly, she took a small step forward, testing the ground after months of uncertainty. I don't remember everything, she whispered, but I feel like I belong with you. Gerald exhaled a shaky breath, his relief palpable. That's enough, he assured her. We have all the time in the world now. Calvin, sensing the moment was right, reached out his hand. Can we go home now? All together. Evelyn hesitated for only a second before nodding. Yes, she whispered. Let's go home. As they walked to the car, Evelyn nestled between Gerald and Calvin, the baby stirring in her arms. The oppressive weight of the past months seemed to lift. The dark alley they left behind no longer mattered, only the road ahead. Minutes later, Gerald's car pulled into the Grand Hawkins estate. The mansion loomed in the moonlight, casting long, wavering shadows across the manicured lawn. Evelyn stared at it, her breath catching. It was familiar, and yet so foreign. "We're here," Gerald said softly, turning off the engine. His eyes searched hers in the dim light. "Are you ready to go inside?" Evelyn swallowed hard, her fingers tightening on the baby. "I think so," she admitted. "It feels like a dream, distant but real." Gerald stepped out, walking around to open her door. He extended his hand, not just as support, but as an unspoken promise. Calvin hopped out of the back seat, his eyes darting between Evelyn and the house, anticipation clear on his face. The gravel crunched beneath their feet as they approached the door. The night wind whispered through the trees, as if nature itself was welcoming them home. "Mr. Hawkins?" Calvin whispered, tugging at Gerald's sleeve. "Do you think Mistress Evelyn will like living here? And the baby?" Gerald smiled reassuringly. "I'm sure they will, Calvin. This is her home, just like it's yours too. We're family now." Inside, the grand entrance hall was bathed in soft, golden light. The elegance of the space felt overwhelming. Evelyn hesitated at the threshold, her fingers trailing against the cool marble walls as if trying to unlock buried memories. The baby stirred, its tiny cries breaking the silence. Gerald turned to Evelyn, his expression unreadable. Then, with the softest voice, he asked, "May I hold our son?" Evelyn looked down at the baby, her protective instincts warring with the trust growing inside her. After a beat, she slowly, almost reverently, handed the child to Gerald. The moment the baby was in his arms, Gerald's breath hitched. Tears welled in his eyes as he stared at the tiny face, his son. The baby blinked up at him, his tiny fingers grasping at the air. "Hello, little one," Gerald whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He traced the baby's features, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. "I'm your father. I'm sorry it took me so long to find you, but I promise from now on, I'll always be here." Calvin, watching from the side, fidgeted, his excitement barely contained. "Mr. Hawkins?" he asked tentatively. Can I see him too? He's my brother now, right?" Gerald turned to him, smiling through his tears. "Of course, Calvin." He bent down so the boy could get a closer look. Calvin's eyes widened in awe as he reached out, his fingers brushing against the baby's tiny hand. "Hi, little brother," he whispered. "I'm Calvin. I'll take care of you and teach you lots of cool things, okay?" The baby cooed softly, as if responding. Evelyn watched the interaction, her heart aching in a way she didn't quite understand. She didn't remember everything, but in that moment, she knew one thing for certain. She was home. The soft, rhythmic coos of the baby filled the air, blending with Calvin's quiet laughter. Evelyn watched the scene unfold before her, a warmth spreading through her chest despite the lingering confusion in her mind. Seeing Gerald and Calvin interacting with the baby awakened something deep within her, a feeling of belonging she couldn't fully explain. The Hawkins estate was no longer the quiet, solemn place it once had been. It was now a whirlwind of activity. Doctors came and went, examining Evelyn and the baby, their professional voices blending with the occasional cries of the infant and Calvin's curious questions. Therapists worked tirelessly with Evelyn, guiding her through the labyrinth of her lost memories. Some sessions offered glimpses of clarity, others left her frustrated, lost in an abyss of forgotten time. Gerald divided his time between tending to Evelyn, bonding with his newly discovered son, and ensuring Calvin felt secure amidst all the changes. He spent sleepless nights feeding the baby and comforting Evelyn when she woke up disoriented. During the day, he made sure to spend quality time with Calvin, helping him with homework, taking him on walks, and simply being present. The golden morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Hawkins mansion, casting a warm glow over the grand living room. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint scent of baby powder. Evelyn sat on the couch, gently rocking the sleeping baby in her arms, her eyes distant, lost in thought. Gerald sat beside her, his coffee untouched, his attention fixed on her face. Calvin, sitting cross-legged on the plush rug, played idly with his toys, but his eyes kept drifting to Evelyn as if to make sure she was still there. Breaking the silence, Evelyn spoke softly. "I had another flashback last night." Gerald immediately leaned forward, setting his cup down. "What did you remember, darling?" It's okay if you don't want to talk about it. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, gripping the baby just a little tighter, as if seeking comfort. I was driving, she whispered. It was raining heavily. The roads were slick. The raindrops pounded against the windshield, making it hard to see. I had just left the doctor's office. I had just found out about the pregnancy, and I was on my way home to tell you. Her voice wavered, emotion thickening her words. I remember feeling so happy, so eager to share the news with you. Gerald's jaw tightened, his hands instinctively reaching for hers, offering silent support. Calvin had stopped playing altogether, his wide eyes locked onto Evelyn. She swallowed hard before continuing. Then suddenly, bright lights. She gasped slightly, as if reliving the moment. A truck. It came out of nowhere, skidding in the rain. I swerved, and after that, it's all a blur. Just pain, confusion, and then nothing. A heavy silence settled over the room. Gerald reached out, pulling her close, careful of the baby nestled between them. His voice was thick with emotion. It's all right now, you're safe. You both are. Evelyn opened her eyes, unshed tears glistening in them. After that, I remember wandering the streets, confused, scared. After the baby was born, the only thing that mattered was keeping him safe. It was like the rest of me had been lost in that accident. Calvin, sensing the weight of the moment, slowly approached the couch. His small voice trembled. Is that why you helped me, Mistress Evelyn? Like how you helped me that night? Evelyn's lips trembled into a gentle smile. She reached out, stroking his hair, the gesture feeling strangely instinctive. Yes, sweetheart. I think even without my memories, a part of me knew I had to protect children. Perhaps it was my maternal instinct guiding me. Gerald, watching them, felt his heart swell with gratitude. He had spent months searching for Evelyn, desperate to bring her home. Now, seeing her here, reclaiming pieces of her past, he knew it had all been worth it. Clearing his throat, he decided it was time to share the news he had been keeping. Calvin, Evelyn, there's something I've been meaning to say. All eyes turned to him, curiosity and anticipation thick in the air. I've started the final adoption process for Calvin. Calvin's breath hitched. His wide eyes darted between Evelyn and Gerald, searching their faces for confirmation. You mean? Gerald nodded. I want you to officially be part of this family. Not just as someone we care for, but as our son. Calvin's lips parted, but no words came. When he finally found his voice, it trembled with emotion. You'll have custody of me. You'll be my parents for real. Gerald reached forward, placing firm but gentle hands on the boy's shoulders. No, champ. It's not because you helped find Evelyn that night. It's because of who you are, brave, kind, smart. You already belong here. Now, we just want to make it official. If you want that too. Tears welled in Calvin's eyes before spilling over. He threw himself into Gerald's arms, sobbing into his chest. Yes, I want to. I want so much. Evelyn watched them, feeling the final pieces of the puzzle slotting into place. It was as if a fog had lifted from her mind, revealing the love she had shared with Gerald, the dreams they had once spoken of, the family they had envisioned. It was all here, within reach. Gerald, she whispered, a new clarity in her voice. I remember. Not everything, but I remember us. Our love. Our plans. How we dreamed of building a family together. Gerald's breath caught. Evelyn, you remember? A radiant smile lit up her face for the first time in weeks. Yes, and I want this. I want us, all of us together. A family. You, me, Calvin, and our baby. She reached out, gently cupping Calvin's face. If you'll have us, dear, we'll be your parents. Forever. Against all odds, the Hawkins family had finally come together. What began as an act of bravery from a street kid, followed by months of relentless searching, had culminated in a new beginning, one filled with love, hope, and unwavering commitment. As the sun set over the Hawkins estate, bathing the room in golden hues, one thing was certain. This was not the end of their story. It was only the beginning of a new and beautiful journey. How did you like this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What's your score? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to catch all our stories. For more emotional tales, click here on the end screen.